I'd imagined this moment differently. 2 days on the road had given me plenty of time to picture it. Her smiling at the door, hugging me like she used to, showing me around with that quick, excited voice she always had when something mattered to her. Instead, I stood on her porch, suitcase by my side, as she cracked the door just wide enough for her face to peer. The first thing she did wasn't hug me. It was glance over her shoulder, as if checking who might be watching. Then she stepped outside, closing the door behind her. She leaned in, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of her perfume. "Don't tell the neighbors you're my father," she said quietly. "Just say you're an old family friend." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. "What?" I asked, half smiling, waiting for the laugh that never came. Her eyes didn't move. "Please, just trust me on this." Before I could answer, she turned, opened the door, and waved for me to follow her in. Her smile switched on instantly as she greeted a woman passing by on the sidewalk. To the neighbor, she was all warmth. To me, she was unreadable. Inside, she took my coat like nothing unusual had been said. I placed my suitcase in the corner, feeling like I had just agreed to something I didn't understand. The air between us was polite, but it wasn't familiar. The first time the neighbors came over, 2 women bringing a pie, she introduced me exactly as she'd asked. "This is an old friend of the family," she said, smiling. I shook their hands, playing along, the words sitting heavy in my mouth. It wasn't the lie itself that hurt. It was the choice to make me part of it. Over the next few hours, I kept noticing small things. How she avoided talking about her childhood. How she steered conversations away from anything that might connect us. I'd start to mention something. A trip we'd taken, a memory from when she was little, and she'd interrupt with a question to someone else or a comment about the house. At dinner, her husband talked about work while she asked me safe, surface questions. "How was the drive? Did you stop anywhere interesting?" Not once did she mention the years we'd shared under the same roof. I answered, smiled when it was expected, and kept the rest to myself. I've learned that sometimes silence is the only way to keep your dignity intact. Later, when I was alone in the guest room, I replayed that moment at the door. I thought about the way she'd looked at me. Not embarrassed exactly, but careful, like I was a part of her life that didn't fit the story she was telling here. I wonder what version of herself she'd built for this place, for these neighbors. I wonder where I fit in that version, if I fit at all. Part of me wanted to confront her right away, to ask why she'd feel the need to hide me. But another part of me knew that whatever her reason was, hearing it now would only make the rest of the visit harder. So I kept my thoughts to myself. The next morning, over coffee, she talked about the neighborhood, the garden club, the block parties, the quiet streets. I nodded, listening, the mug warm in my hands. When she mentioned how everyone here has a certain standard, I caught the slight hesitation in her voice. She didn't have to explain it. I understood. I remember the years when things weren't easy, when I worked double shifts, wore the same jacket winter after winter, made do with what I had. Maybe in her mind, that version of me didn't belong here. Maybe she thought it would make people see her differently. I didn't agree with her choice, but I understood the fear behind it. That night, I sat outside on the back porch. The air was cool and the house was quiet. Through the window, I could see her moving around the kitchen, laughing at something her husband said. I thought about all the ways we learn to protect ourselves, not always by telling the truth, but sometimes by reshaping it. She'd reshape me into a family friend, and for now, that's who I would be. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't approval. It was just acceptance of the moment as it was. When I finally went inside, she smiled at me. It wasn't the same as the smile she gave the neighbors, but it was something, and I carried that small something with me, knowing the way the visit had already shifted, and that the days ahead would tell me just how much. If your heart's in a story like ours, support it with a like and subscribe, and we'd love to know where you're watching from. I woke early the next morning, long before the house stirred. Old habits die hard. Years of rising before dawn for work had fixed my body to the clock, no matter how far from home I was. The guest room was comfortable, though it didn't feel like it belonged to me, not even for a night. The walls were bare except for a framed print of a coastal scene. There were no family photos, no small signs that this was a home connected to my daughter's life before now. As I dressed, I thought about all the rooms she'd grown up in, bedrooms where her drawings were taped to the walls, living rooms where we'd eaten dinner on the couch, kitchens where she'd sat at the table doing homework while I cooked. Every one of those spaces had some trace of her. But here, there was no trace of me. By the time I stepped into the hallway, the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. I followed it, stopping just short when I heard her voice. She was on the phone, speaking softly. "Yes, he's here just for a few days. No, it's fine." Her tone wasn't hostile, but it carried a caution I couldn't ignore. When she saw me, she ended the call quickly. "Morning," she said, smiling as though nothing had happened. "Morning," I replied, taking a seat at the small breakfast table. She poured me coffee and asked about my sleep. I told her it was fine, though that wasn't entirely true. It had been restless, not because of the bed, but because of the weight of yesterday's words still sitting with me. We ate in silence for a while. Her husband came in, kissed her cheek, and left for work with a polite nod in my direction. I noticed how easily he fit into this world she'd built. He seemed like someone who belonged here. After breakfast, she offered to give me a tour of the house. I agreed, curious to see the life she'd made for herself. The rooms were immaculate, not overly decorated, but carefully arranged. Everything seemed chosen to reflect a certain image. Neutral colors, polished furniture, curated simplicity. When we reached the living room, I noticed a gallery wall filled with framed photographs. Weddings, vacations, dinners with friends. Not one picture from her childhood. Not one of us. I stopped in front of it. She noticed. "I wanted a fresh start here," she said quickly, as if reading my thoughts. I nodded, though my chest tightened. Nothing wrong with that. We moved on to the upstairs bedrooms. The master was spacious and bright. The second bedroom was set up as a home office. The third was a guest room, the one I was staying in. "It's nice," I said, but I couldn't help feeling like a placeholder in my own daughter's life. A visitor, a name she didn't want attached to hers in this neighborhood. Later that afternoon, she suggested we walk to the park nearby. As we strolled, she pointed out houses, mentioning which ones belonged to which neighbors. She waved at people, smiled easily. I noticed how she introduced me. Never with my name, never with Dad. Just, "This is a family friend visiting from out of town." It was strange, hearing myself reduced to that. Stranger still how smoothly she said it, like she'd rehearsed. I wanted to ask her why, but I didn't. Not yet. There's a time for questions, and there's a time for listening to what's left unsaid. That evening, I sat in the living room while she cooked dinner. The sound from the kitchen, the clatter of pans, the hiss of something frying, reminded me of when she was little. Back then, she'd sit on the counter and talk about her day while I cooked. Now, the only voices were hers and her husband's, trading bits of conversation I wasn't a part of. After dinner, I offered to help clean up. She waved me off. "You're a guest," she said. The word felt like a boundary, not a kindness. When I went upstairs at night, I paused in the hallway, looking down at the living room from above. She was curled on the couch with her husband, laughing at something on TV. It wasn't that she didn't care about me. I knew she did, in her own way. But somewhere along the line, she'd drawn a line between the life we shared and the one she wanted now. As I lay in bed, I realized something. I wasn't here to change her mind. I wasn't here to make her claim me. I was here to see who she'd become, even if that meant seeing who she didn't want to be. And for now, that meant staying in the rooms without my name. Sleep wouldn't settle. I lay counting the small noises of the house I didn't belong to until I gave up, pulled on my jacket, and walked the hall like a man moving through someone else's museum. I wasn't hunting for answers, only air. The kitchen offered a glow from the fridge and a note. Sparkling water, almond milk, flowers, life arranged into lists. A thin line of light leaked from the laundry room, and beyond it the garage door sat barely ajar. I tugged the cord. A cone of yellow fell over shelves labeled by season. Decorations wound tight, as if they'd been told to hold their breath. Among the neat boxes was one that didn't match. Her handwriting on the side. Old things. I slid it to the bench. Tape gave with a sigh, and a different home opened. On top lay rubber-banded photos. She was 6 in the first. 2 teeth missing, a fish almost as long as her arm, my sunburnt grin behind her. 12 in the next, hat crooked, dirt on her knees. The day sliding stopped scaring her. 18 in another, cap and gown, my hand on her shoulder as we pretended not to cry. Paper lifted, landed, and the room went quiet in that way only memory can manage. Beneath the photos, a small glove we bought used and oiled together. I pressed my palm into it and felt the ghost of her hand. A construction paper card. Best dad ever. The glue heavy and sincere. I didn't smile. I breathed out and kept going. Envelopes waited at the bottom. Emails about buying, my late-night reply. If this is what you want, I'll help. Receipts for tools I'd sold. Bank withdrawals that turned years into numbers. Then the contract. My name where counties look first. Hers beside it, smaller. Percentages that told the truth no living room wanted a host. I photographed each page. Not to start a fight, but because some truths deserve a witness. You kept it, I said to no one, and the bulb hummed as if it knew. A car passed. The garage trembled and returned to stillness. I packed the box with care, except for one photo. The fish, the gap-toothed grin. My hand steady at her back. That one slipped into my wallet behind a tired license. On the way out, I read the list again. Sparkling water, almond milk, flowers, and set my glass in sink. Lists were safer than history. I turned off the light. Back in the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet name what had happened. I'd been stored, not discarded. Cataloged with the old things, kept close enough to reach, far enough to hide. It wasn't cruelty. It was fear wearing neat handwriting. I thought about waking her, about asking why a father should need permission to exist. Then I remembered the girl in those photos and the lessons I'd taught her. Breathe, count to 10, count again. I could practice what I preached. A decision arrived without ceremony. I would stop asking to be included and start asking for the truth. No speeches, no scenes, just names on deeds, numbers on lines, and pictures that didn't require captions. Dignity can be patient. So can justice. Before sleep, another thought surfaced, not anger, but arithmetic. Down payments, percentages, signatures that meant decisions couldn't be made without the person who signed first. I wasn't the past. I was part of the foundation. If a house leans, you don't blame the roof, you check the footing. Maybe that's all this was now. An inspection no one had scheduled. I pictured the neighbor party she'd mentioned for weekend. The way she wanted to borrow a shirt that fit their story better than mine. I could hear her voice, gentle and practiced. He's visiting from out of state. I tried the words and felt how small they made things. Titles were easy. Ownership was harder. In the quiet, I tested a single sentence aloud to see if it carried more heat than I wanted. I'm your father. The room held it without echo. Then another, truer. I'm the one who helped you buy this place. Both belonged to the same reality. One asked for credit. The other asked for honesty. I lay back and watched ceiling patterns dissolve. Somewhere a pipe clicked. I held the fish photo in my mind. The way my hand steadied her elbow without calling attention to itself. That was the work now. A steadying, not a spectacle. Not to shame her, not to win, only to stop the drift. Around 4, sleep finally found me. Morning would bring coffee and small talk, and my decision to stay silent one more day. I would carry proof like a quiet anchor, and when the time was right, I would place it on the table between us and ask her to see what had always been there. The weekend arrived with the sound of laughter bleeding through the fence. The neighbors had come in waves, heels tapping on the pavement, men in button-downs carrying bottles and desserts. From the upstairs guest room window, I could see their backyard strung with lights, the kind that make any space look warmer than it is. I heard her call my name from downstairs. Dad, sorry, Mark, can you come help with the chairs? I walked down, already knowing what the performance would be. In the driveway, I unfolded metal chairs while she handed me a folded note. Don't mention the mortgage. Just like that, I'd been reduced to stage directions. The guests didn't see the exchange. They saw a man in rolled sleeves, doing the kind of work that doesn't need introduction. The evening light turned gold as people settled. I took my place near the back, half in shadow. She was everywhere, refilling glasses, introducing Mark to this couple, that couple, an old family friend, she said with that same warm smile, like the words had been rehearsed. I nodded at each face, letting them believe whatever kept the air smooth. It might have been easier if no one asked questions, but people are curious by nature. A man with a silver watch leaned toward me. So how do you know them? I sipped my drink. We go back a long way. It was true, even if they'd never hear how far. The host, a cheerful woman with sun-warmed skin, made her way over. We're so glad you could come. We were wondering who this mysterious friend was. Just passing through, I said, they've built a beautiful home here. The woman smiled, the kind you give when you've been handed a sealed envelope you'll never open. From where I stood, I could see her laughing with her husband, her head tilted in that practiced way. I remembered when that laugh was easy, when it didn't need to be calibrated for company. Plates were passed, drinks refreshed. Someone set down a plate of roasted vegetables near me, and I realized I hadn't eaten all day. I took one bite before another guest asked if I lived nearby. Not anymore, I told them, but I've left a lot here. It wasn't until dessert that the shift happened. A man across the table began talking about renovations. You know, the hardest part is the down payment, he said. She laughed lightly, eyes flicking toward me for the briefest moment. We got lucky. The word sat there, harmless to everyone else. But I heard what she didn't say. Not a word about the tools I sold, the savings I emptied, the contract I signed with my name first. I set down my fork. Silence can be a gift or a weapon. Tonight, it was both. I decided not to correct her. Not here. Not now. The truth didn't need to fight its way through cake and small talk. It just needed to be ready when the air was clear. By the time the plates were stacked, the music had softened. People began to drift home, hugging, promising dinners that would never happen. I stayed until the last guest left, folding chairs in the driveway, while she thanked me without looking me in the eye. You didn't say anything, she said finally, almost to herself. Not tonight, I answered. And I didn't explain, because she wasn't asking for an explanation. She was checking the damage. Inside, the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I washed my hands in the kitchen sink, the water running over my fingers like it could carry something away. She moved past me, setting leftover cake in the fridge, her wedding ring catching the light. You know, I said quietly, it's not the neighbors I mind. It's you. She paused, but didn't turn around. I just don't want him to think. She trailed off, the sentence collapsing under its own weight. I dried my hands and stepped back. You don't get to decide how much of me is allowed to exist here. The words landed, not with anger, but with the steadiness of someone who's already decided what comes next. She didn't reply. The silence between us was thicker than the one I'd carried at the party. That night, in the guest room, I could still hear the faint echo of music through the walls. Only now, it wasn't the neighbors' laughter that kept me awake. It was a picture in my wallet, the box in the garage, and the growing certainty that pretending was its own kind of betrayal. I knew then I wouldn't be visiting much longer. When I left, it would not be with a scene or an argument. It would be with the same patience I'd carried all weekend, and with something else, my story, ready to be told when it mattered. By Sunday morning, the house felt like a stage after the show had ended. The chairs were stacked in the garage, the leftover wine bottles lined along the counter, and the air was heavy with the smell of last night's food. I woke early, not from rest, but from knowing what I had to do. I opened the closet in the guest room and started folding my clothes. Slow, deliberate movements. The zipper on my suitcase sounded too loud in the quiet. I paused between each shirt, not because I needed a break, but because it felt wrong to rush. The window looked out toward the street. Cars were still parked along the curb from the party. A reminder of all the smiles and small talk I'd walked through like a shadow. I wondered if any of those people knew my name. I doubted it. Halfway through packing, I found a small wooden box I brought with me. Inside were photographs, letters, and the watch my father had left me. None of it belonged here. Not anymore. I wrapped the box in one of my shirts and set it in the bottom of the suitcase, hidden but not forgotten. I heard movement downstairs. Cabinets opening, footsteps across the tile. She was up. For a moment, I thought about going down, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, and telling her exactly how I felt. But that would turn into explanations, and explanations always end up sounding like excuses to the wrong ears. Instead, I zipped the suitcase and set it by the door. I took the folded blanket from the bed and placed it back in the closet, smoothing it flat with my hand. My mother used to say, "Leave a place better than you found it." I wasn't sure I'd manage that here, but I could at least leave it as it was. When I finally went downstairs, she was in the kitchen pouring coffee. She glanced up, then looked back down at the cup. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said. I waited for her to ask about my plans, but she didn't. The silence stretched between us. She sipped her coffee, and I poured my own, the clink of the spoon against the mug the only sound. I wanted to remember her like this, quiet, without the edges that came out around other people. But even in this stillness, the distance was there, wide and settled. After breakfast, I stepped outside for some air. The sun was just starting to push through the clouds. The neighbor's sprinklers clicked in the distance, and somewhere a dog barked. It was the kind of morning that should have felt peaceful. But peace only comes when the weight you're carrying belongs to you, not when it's something handed to you by someone you love. I went back in, poured the last of my coffee down the sink, and rinsed the mug. She was at the counter, scrolling through her phone. "I might head out today," I said. Her thumb paused on the screen. "Oh, so soon?" I nodded. "Got some things to take care of." She didn't ask what things. Didn't ask if I'd come back. Just gave a small, polite nod, like I just told her I was stepping out to buy milk. I carried my suitcase to the car without another word. The gravel on the driveway crunched under my shoes, each step sounding like the closing of a door. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk, making sure the wooden box was secure. Before I got in the car, I stood for a moment, looking back at the house. The curtains in the living room were open, but she wasn't there. Part of me had hoped she'd come out, that we'd have one of those unplanned moments where everything spills out raw and unpolished. But the door stayed closed. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The hum of it filled the space around me, drowning out whatever I might have said if I'd stayed. As I drove away, the street looked the same as it had when I arrived. Neat lawns, clean sidewalks, quiet mornings. But for me, everything had shifted. I wasn't leaving angry. I wasn't leaving hurt. I was leaving because some distances can't be closed, no matter how many miles you drive to try. By the time I hit the main road, the house was out of sight. I didn't check the mirror. I didn't need to. Some goodbyes are better left unspoken. Not because the words aren't there, but because the silence says everything. 2 weeks later, I was back in my own kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock filling the silence. The trip already felt like a distant place I'd visited in another lifetime. The suitcase still sat in the corner, unpacked except for the clothes I'd needed. The wooden box stayed on the table, right where I'd placed it the night I got home. I'd told no one about what happened. Not my friends from the diner, not the old neighbor who'd asked how the visit went. I'd just said it was fine and left it there. That was the truth in its simplest form, stripped of every detail that would invite questions I didn't want to answer. One afternoon, I stopped by the grocery store. As I stood in line, Mrs. Patterson, a woman I'd known since my daughter was in school, leaned toward me. "I heard you visited her new place," she said with a smile. "Must have been so nice," seeing her settled. "It was," I said, and meant it in a way she'd never guess. Nice to see her walls, her life, the way she'd arranged her space, even if it didn't have room for me. She went on about how proud I must be. I nodded at the right times, offered small words that fit into the shape of the conversation. I didn't tell her about the whisper at the door, the careful distance my daughter had kept. Not because I wanted to protect my daughter, but because saying it out loud would make it heavier than it already was. The thing about keeping something inside is that it changes shape over time. At first, it's sharp, pressing against you every time you move. But slowly, it wears down like a stone in a river until you can carry it without wincing. That's what this had become, a weight I'd learned to hold without showing the strain. One evening, my daughter called. Her voice was lighter than it had been during my visit. She talked about work, about the plants she'd started growing on her balcony, about a recipe she'd tried and failed at. I listened, adding small laughs where they fit, letting her fill the space. When she finally asked, "So, how have you been?" I told her about the weather, about fixing the squeaky hinge on the back door, about nothing important. We kept it safe. Neither of us stepped toward the truth. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time. I thought about how much I'd wanted her to see me for who I was, not the job I worked, not the version she wanted to present to her neighbors, but the man who had carried her on his shoulders, who had stayed up through her fevers, who had driven across states just to be at her doorstep. But life doesn't always give you that moment. Sometimes you have to find your peace without it. A few days later, I was at the diner for my shift. The lunch crowd was light, and the TV in the corner was showing a local segment about a charity event I'd been part of. They'd filmed it weeks earlier, me speaking briefly, handing over a donation check, shaking hands with a few familiar faces. The sound was low, but one of the customers noticed. "Hey, that's you," he said, pointing at the screen. I glanced up and smiled. "Yeah, that's me." More heads turned. A few asked about it, and I told them the basics. How we'd raise money, where it went, why it mattered. No fanfare, no need to make it more than it was. Later that night, I wonder if my daughter would see it, if one of her neighbors might mention it, connecting the man on their TV to the old family friend she'd introduced, if it would change anything. But the truth was, I didn't need it to. That's the thing about dignity. You stop carrying it like something that needs to be proven. It just becomes part of you, whether anyone else notices or not. So, when people asked about my trip, I kept my answer simple. It was nice, I'd say with a small smile, and that was all they needed to know, because what I chose to tell wasn't the whole story. The rest stayed with me, in the quiet spaces where I kept the parts of my life that didn't need to be shared. And in those quiet spaces, I found something I hadn't expected: peace. Thank you for watching till the end. If the message stayed with you, give it a like, subscribe for more, and let us know how it made you feel.